Greenpeace is a protest-focused, environmentalist, non-governmental organization that was originally founded in Canada in the 1970s, but which has since gone on to tackle issues ranging from commercial whaling to concerns about genetic engineering worldwide. They have 26 independent organizations operating across nearly 60 countries, and their efforts are funded by a combination of grants and donations from individual supporters. And that's an important detail, as they engage in a lot of highly visible acts of protest, many of which probably would not be feasible if they had corporate or government funders. They piss a lot of people off, in other words, and even folks who consider themselves to be environmentalists aren't always happy with the things they do. Greenpeace is vehemently anti-nuclear, for instance, and that includes nuclear power. And some folks who are quite green in their leanings consider nuclear power to be part of the renewable energy solution, not something to be clamped down on. The same is true of their other stances, like their protests against genetic engineering efforts, and their at times arguably heavy-handed ecotage activities, which means sabotage for ecological purposes, to making their point and disrupting efforts, like cutting down forests or building new oil pipelines that they don't like. Despite being a persistent thorn in the side of giant corporations like oil companies, and despite sometimes irritating their fellow environmentalists who don't always agree with their focuses or approaches, Greenpeace has nonetheless persisted for decades, in part because of their appreciation for spectacle and their ability to get things that might otherwise be invisible, like whaling and Arctic oil exploration, into the press. This, in turn, has at times raised sufficient awareness that politicians have been forced to take a stand on things they wouldn't have otherwise been forced to voice an opinion on, much less support or push against. And that is often the point of protests of any size or type by any organization. A recent ruling by a court in North Dakota, though, could hobble this group's future efforts. A company involved in the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline accused Greenpeace of defamation, trespass, nuisance, civil conspiracy, and other acts, and has been awarded about $667 million in damages payable by Greenpeace because of the group's efforts to disrupt the construction of this pipeline. The folks at the head of Greenpeace had previously said that a large payout in this case could bankrupt the organization. And while there is still a chance to appeal the ruling, and they've said they intend to do so, this ruling is already being seen as a possible fulcrum for companies, politicians, and government agencies that want to limit protests in the US, where the right to assemble and peaceably express one's views are constitutionally protected by the First Amendment, but where restrictions on protest have long been used by government officials and police to stifle protests that they don't like for various reasons. What I'd like to talk about today is another somewhat unusual wave of protests that we're seeing in the US and to some degree globally right now too, and the larger legal context in which these protests are taking place. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. When US President Trump first stepped into office back in early 2017, there were protests galore. Huge waves of people coming out to protest the very idea of him, but especially his seeming comfort with and even celebration of anti-immigration, racist, and misogynistic views and practices, including his alleged sexual abuse and rape of dozens of women, one of whom successfully took him to court on the matter, winning a big settlement for proving that he did indeed sexually assault her. The response to his second win and his ascension to office for another term in 2025 has been more muted. There have been a lot of protests, but not at the scale of those that were seen in 2017. Instead, the majority of enthusiasm for protest-related action against this administration has been aimed at Elon Musk, a man who regularly tops the world's richest people lists, who owns big-name companies like Tesla and SpaceX, and who has his own collection of very public scandals and alleged abuses. One such scandal revolves around Musk's decision to plow hundreds of millions of dollars into getting Trump reelected. As a result of that investment, he was brought into the president's confidence and now serves as a sort of hatchet man via a pseudo-official agency called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Musk and his team have been jumping from government agency to government agency, conducting mass firings, harassing employees, hacking, and by some accounts stealing and deleting all sorts of sensitive data, and generally doing their best to cause as much disruption as possible. Many of their efforts have been pushed back against, eventually, by courts, but that's only after a lot of damage has already been done. The general theory of their operation, why they're doing things the way that they are, is ostensibly to cut costs in the US government. And though outside analysts and watchdogs have shown that they have not really managed to do that at any scale, and that their actions will probably actually cost more, will add to the government's deficit, not reduce it, Musk and Trump claim otherwise, and that is enough for many people in their orbit. The unsaid purpose of this group, though, seems to be making the government so ineffective and hollow that businesses like Musk's and those of his friends can step in and do things that were previously done by the government, and can reap massive profits as a consequence. Citizens having to pay more for what was previously provided by the government, and a bunch of rich folks profiting because they are the only ones capable of providing such services now that these agencies have been gutted. The courts are still scrambling as they move a lot slower than individuals with seeming authority and the backing of a vindictive president can move, but this has already caused a lot of consternation across the political spectrum, and Musk, though popular with a certain flavor of Republican and far-right voter, has pissed off a lot more conventional Republicans in addition to pretty much every Democrat. This is important context for understanding why the most vocal and enthusiastic protests in the US these first few months of 2025 have targeted Musk, and more specifically, Musk's electric vehicle company, Tesla. Now, Tesla was once celebrated by the political left as an electric vehicle company that made EVs sexy and popular at a time in which this type of vehicle was anything but. Musk's shift to the political far right changed that, though, and the general theory of these protests is that Musk is mostly held financially afloat by Tesla's huge market valuation. Tesla stocks are worth way more than those of other car companies, with a price multiple, that's how much a stock is worth compared to how much business the company actually does and how much their assets are worth. That stock price is more akin to that of a dot-com era tech startup than a car company. Tesla's stock price is valued at something like 120 times the apparent book value of the company. So Musk, who owns a lot of Tesla stock, can basically borrow money against all that stock, and this allows him to tap tens of billions of dollars worth of borrowed cash on a whim, because the banks know that he's good for it. In this way, he can inflate his supposed worth while also getting liquid cash whenever he needs it, despite not having to sell those stocks that he owns. This method of acquiring liquid assets by leveraging non-liquid assets has allowed him to support Trump's reascension, but it's also allowed him to do things like buy Twitter, which he has renamed X and converted into a sort of voice box for the right and far right. It has also allowed him to do things like offer money to potential voters who are signed up to vote and who sign petitions that are supportive of far-right causes, which is not quite paying for votes, which is illegal in the US, but it is the closest thing to paying for votes you can get away with. And there is still debate whether this is legal or not, but either way, until the courts catch up on this, he has been able to influence vote outcomes to varying degrees because of that access to money and promising to give some money to people who probably will vote the way that he wants them to vote. Some of the biggest and most consistent protesting efforts in the second-term Trump US have revolved around Tesla, its cars, and its dealerships. And the theory of operation here is that by protesting Tesla, you might be able to decrease the company's market valuation, how much their stock is worth, which in turn decreases Musk's access to money. Less market value for the company means Musk cannot borrow as much money against it. And if he has less access to liquid wealth, to cash, rather than stocks and other illiquid assets, he may become less relevant to the administration and less capable of influencing elections across the country and to some degree the world as well, as he's been throwing money at candidates he favors globally, too. These protests have been traditional in the sense of gathering peacefully outside Tesla dealerships and chanting slogans and carrying signs, but there have also been acts of protest of a more aggressive variety, including spray painting Tesla vehicles, doing things to embarrass folks who own these cars, and in some cases setting them on fire or otherwise destroying or harming them. The general idea, again, is to make this brand toxic, which in turn should reduce sales, and that ideally, for the protesters at least, would then reduce Musk's access to money, which he is using to influence elections and other such activities and outcomes. The administration has responded to these protests with a bizarre and it's generally agreed pretty embarrassing car commercial, essentially, for Tesla, which was held outside the White House, in which Trump claimed he was buying a vehicle and told Americans to buy Tesla cars to support the company because it is wholesome and American. Trump also recently said that he would consider people caught defacing Teslas or even just protesting the brand in non-destructive ways to be domestic terrorists, which is a pretty chilling thought, as some post-9/11 rules about how the government can treat terrorists are still on the books. Calling someone a terrorist in the US is a means of doing away with due process and human rights, basically. So this is a threat to go full violent authoritarian on people who are using their First Amendment rights in ways that the administration doesn't like. These protests are occurring within the context of another notable protest-oriented storyline, too, one in which students who participated in protests against the US and Israel's actions in Gaza at Columbia University in New York last spring have been arrested. One was on a visa to the US and was in the process of becoming a doctor. Her visa has now been revoked. And the other, who has a green card and who is thus a permanent US resident and who has no criminal record, faces a case in immigration court in Louisiana where he was shipped after being arrested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. His hearing has been scheduled for April 8th, and his lawyers are challenging both his detention and the government's apparent efforts to make an example of him, trying to deport him and do away with his citizenship because he protested against the government's actions in Gaza. The administration is claiming they can do this and can do a bunch of other stuff, including deporting immigrants who they claim without evidence are members of a Venezuelan gang. They say they can do this because there is legal precedent that gives them the ability to deport enemy aliens, those who are antagonistic to the US and its government. The same sort of rulings that were used to justify deporting anyone sympathetic to the Communist Party back in the mid to late 20th century. This same concept is being floated to justify the deportation of some of the people who have protested against Israel's and the US's actions in Gaza. The accusation being that they are supporting Hamas and other organizations that have been declared terrorist organizations by the US. So when folks protest against these governments' activities in the region, they are also, according to this interpretation, supporting the causes of terrorist organizations, which then arguably gives the US the right to deport them because they were not born in the United States. The legality of all of this is still being debated, and it's working its way through the court system. But the ultimate goal seems to be giving this administration the ability to deport whomever they like, and establishing that immigrants of any kind do not have the free speech rights that natural-born U.S. citizens enjoy, which is not concretely established in U.S. law, and which these many efforts in court cases seem to be intended to map out more formally, to give the US government that ability and to take away those assumed rights for this category of people living in the United States. This administration has also shown itself to be just really antagonistic to any person or entity that defies or criticizes it, including journalistic entities, politicians, or protesting individuals. They have used lawsuits and executive orders and a slew of other tools to legally punish, to financially punish, and in some cases to socially punish these people and groups, telling their supporters that it would be a real shame if something happened to these people, seemingly aiming to scare their opponents while also possibly sparking what's called stochastic violence against them. And this is not a US exclusive trend. In Georgia, the country, not the state, the government is levying huge fines on people who protested against its pivot toward Russia and against the EU 2 years ago. They're using a so-called foreign agent bill to accuse anyone who says or does something against the government of being paid by foreign entities, which in turn allows them to crack down on these people hard, while seemingly not violating their good, dedicated, patriotic citizens' rights. They've also started levying fines for the equivalent of about $16,000 on those who participate in protests that even briefly block traffic, which is one more way to asymmetrically hobble people and organizations that might otherwise cause a regime trouble. Anyone who does things in their favor, protests things that the government doesn't like, can then just have these fines waived or ignored. We are seeing similar things in Turkey and Hungary right now, too. Two other countries that have seen wide-scale protests and significant efforts by their governments to attack protesters, to get them to stop. In some cases, these efforts backfire, leading to more and more substantial pushback by the population against increasingly aggressive and abusive regimes. It is impossible to know ahead of time which way things will go, though. And right now, in the US, most of these anti-protester efforts are still young, as are the anti-Tesla, anti-Musk protests themselves. One side or the other could be forced to pivot by judicial rulings, though this could also lead to a long-predicted constitutional crisis, in which the judges say that the government cannot do something that the government wants to do, and then the government just ignores that ruling, creating an entirely different and arguably more complex and substantial problem. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is the first book in a fairly extensive series of books. I think there's 6 or 7 of them at this point. I've read all of the books in the series that are available right now, and they're all pretty good. This is a dystopian, future, stratified, caste-oriented society sort of book, so it's a little bit tropey in that way, but it has some very memorable and compelling characters. The future society is interesting and, unfortunately, as these things tend to be, a little bit too resonant of what's happening in some parts of the world right now for comfort. There is a good deal of very elaborate violence, but there's also a fair number of interesting ideas and visions of the future that I think would be very compelling for folks who enjoyed, for instance, the Hunger Games series or other speculative science fiction collections of books in that similar vein. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.